Today's podcast is brought to you by Audible. Get a free audiobook download and a 30-day free trial at www.audibletrial.com/historyfangirl. Over 180,000 titles to choose from for your iPhone, Kindle, Android, or MP3 player. My guest today is Alex Cruikshanks. He is the host of the History of Yugoslavia podcast, and he was on at the end of last year. We talked all about Belgrade, and in that episode we expanded a lot out into just the general history of Yugoslavia, because that episode really focused on Belgrade as the center of this empire. And today we're going to talk about an event and a chapter in the history of Yugoslavia that came at the end. So as Yugoslavia was falling and Bosnia was becoming its own nation, it was pretty violent and turbulent. And I think that this is just a piece of the story that I didn't really appreciate till I got there. And still, I know I still need to go back to Bosnia and learn more. So we're going to talk about the massacre at Srebrenica. And thank you so much, Alex, for joining us.
No problem. Good to be here again.
So let's kind of pick up. Yugoslavia is falling apart. What is happening in Bosnia in the early 90s as Yugoslavia is falling?
Well, first, I should probably start with, obviously, when we sort of talked a bit last time I was on about the rise of Milosevic within Serbia, and that results in 89, I think, in the Communist Party, which has governed Yugoslavia ever since the end of the war, falling apart, and they introduce multi-party elections. And so in each of these separate republics, so that's Croatia, Slovenia, Bosnia, Serbia, Montenegro, and Macedonia, they hold individual parliamentary elections. And in both Croatia and Bosnia, these bring to power nationalist parties. In Croatia, that's the Franjo Tudjman's Croatian Democratic Union, who win a majority in the summer of 1990, and then in the autumn of 1990 they hold multi-party elections in Bosnia, and a coalition of nationalist groups from the three main ethnic groups in Bosnia win a majority in the parliament. There is I can go through them for now if you want. There's the Bosnian branch of the Croatian Democratic Union, who represent the Croat population, who are about, at this point, between 15 and 20% of the Bosnian population. There's the Serb Democratic Party, led by Radovan Karadzic, who, representing the Serbs, who were, at this point in time, were about a third of the population, about 33%. And there's the Party of Democratic Action, led by Alija Izetbegovic, who represents the Bosniak, or as it was known then, the Muslim population, who were about between 40 and 45% of the population at the time. So these three parties in coalition win the Bosnian elections, and they go into government. And then, almost as soon as they've done that, they realise that all that was really holding them together was anti-communism, essentially. And now the communists are gone, they start instantly falling out. And as Yugoslavia begins to fall apart, they have very different views of where Bosnia should end up. And in the end, both the Bosniak nationalists and the Croat nationalists favour Bosnian independence. And in the spring of 1992, they begin moving towards that. They call a referendum on Bosnian independence, which is ultimately successful. There's a win for the pro-independence campaign, whereas Karadzic and the Serb nationalists are very much against Bosnian independence. They want to stay inside a shrunken Yugoslavia, which will essentially be Greater Serbia by the back door. And they start looking to violently resist, with support from Serbia proper, Bosnian independence, or at least try to carve out a chunk of Bosnia that they can make Serb Bosnia, essentially. And so in the spring and summer of 1992, but Serb nationalist paramilitaries, supported by groups from Serbia, start initiating like violent coups all over towns in northern and eastern Bosnia, installing Serb nationalist local governments in power, and then they go on from that, starts massacring and committing atrocities against the non-Serb population. Which is where this is the point where the term ethnic cleansing enters the Western consciousness, because that's what Karadzic and the Serb nationalists call what they're doing. They're removing the non-Serb population to create this homogenous ethnic Serb entity, Republika Srpska, which they want to break away from Bosnia and annex to Serbia.
So let's just pause for 1 second, because I don't think most people are aware that this Republika Srpska still exists. So we're talking about we're talking about the violent beginnings of a region that still exists. It's been a few days there, not in the part of it where you and I are talking about today, but it's like you're in Serbia, but you're not.
Mm-hmm.
And like, for example, Serbia is very aligned with Russia. So when I was in a bar waiting for the bus to come, because the public bus for some reason picks up in the parking lot of this bar, and there's like a photograph of Putin behind the bar. Like, it's a very different place and I just think most people don't know it exists. It's strange. Yeah. I liked it a lot. In terms of like, there's a UNESCO site there that's really beautiful, and there's I enjoyed my time there, but when we're talking today, we're not talking about a place that doesn't exist anymore. We're talking about a place that they literally created through ethnic cleansing that still exists, which is crazy.
And it's something that exists in a different form to what it did then, but the institutions that were set up, a lot of them still exist, yes. In eastern Bosnia, the vast majority of the towns from Bijeljina to Vlasenica, Visegrad, you can look any of these up online, there were huge massacres in these places, and the vast majority of the non-Serb population was killed or driven out. There were, however, a few towns in eastern Bosnia where the local non-Serb population managed to put up enough of a defence to avoid the towns being captured. And there's three main towns. Gorazda is the southernmost of them, and that was the only enclave which survived the war. Then there's a very small town, essentially a large village called Žepa, slightly further north than that. And then to the northeast of that is Srebrenica. And that's one of the ones that managed to hold out. There was just enough people there, armed and prepared enough to fight off the attack from the Serb nationalist paramilitaries. But because the rest of eastern Bosnia has been taken over, they were essentially now left as this tiny, isolated enclave, cut off from everywhere else. And if you look at the entity map of Bosnia, Srebrenica is far closer to the border with Serbia than it is to the Federation, to the other part of Bosnia and Herzegovina. And that they're left there in a very desperate situation for the next 3 years, essentially, because in part because it's a very small town, Srebrenica. It probably only had a population of about 6,000 before the war, but because people have been massacred and expelled in every surrounding town, village, etc., there's loads of refugees flooding into the town until it reaches a population of about 40,000, and it can't accommodate this many people. And throughout the autumn and winter of 1992 and the spring of 1993, the local militia, I can't really call it an army at this point, they start trying to fight their way out, to try and link up with the other enclaves in just a desperate attempt to try and render this tiny enclave viable before they all starve to death. And in the spring of 1993, these raids that they go on provoke a reaction by the Republic, what's now the Republika Srpska army. These paramilitaries have been formed into an army by this point, and they then try to capture the town of Srebrenica, to shut down the enclave and to massacre and expel the population there, like they did everywhere else in eastern Bosnia. But just as that fall is about to happen, the UN peacekeepers go on a visit to Srebrenica to try and investigate the situation there, and are induced by the local population into staying to protect the town. And subsequently, a UN resolution is passed establishing Srebrenica as a safe area, in quotation marks, which obliges a small UN peacekeeping force to stay there to try and deter attacks by the Republika Srpska army. And an agreement is a tacit armistice is agreed that both the Srebrenica, who by this time were almost exclusively Bosniak militiamen, and the surrounding Republika Srpska army will both get rid of their weapons surrounding the town and in the town. That demilitarization clause is never actually implemented, but nonetheless, the Srpska army refrained from attacking Srebrenica for the next 2 years, and for the most part, they do let humanitarian convoys into the enclave, which somewhat preserves its survival for the next 2 years.
And this is something that we talked about on the last time you were on the show, but just to refresh, Bosniaks, Croats, Serbs are all mostly the same peoples because they are Slavs and Turks that have been mixed together for centuries, and the difference is religion. So we're literally talking about like a related population whose fault lines are just Catholic, Orthodox, and Muslim.
Yeah, but something I would emphasize with this kind of thing is the divisions are newer than people think. A lot of people try to go back into history and say, oh, this person was Catholic, therefore he must have been a Croat. That's really not an idea that is really set in stone until the early 20th century. Before that, if you look at Croatian politics in the 19th century, you often see people refer to Orthodox Croats, or there's a debate about whether the Orthodox population are Croats or Serbs. And there's quite a bit of a difference of opinion. There are Serb nationalists who insist that all the Slavs in the Balkans are Serbs, regardless of what language they speak and regardless of what religion they are. It's not really until the 20th century that Croats and Serbs really distinguished, and it's not really until the 90s that Croats are really distinguished from Bosniaks. Right up until even a couple of years into the war, there are still some Croat nationalists insisting that both Catholics and Muslims are Croats.
Oh, interesting. I so much, and like not even just Yugoslav history, so much of like world history is like applying all of these things, like all of these divisions retroactively to justify what you want to do today. That generation might know that that's a lie, but the next generation, like you and I are, I was 10 or 11 during this time period. So it's not like I understood what was happening. And then we inherit these terms, and then it's like the world is different than it really was because like hateful people convince people to think a certain way, which is just terrifying. Yeah.
So there was some of the survivors that I spoke to. One of the survivors that I spoke to when I was in Sarajevo. He said growing up he didn't know the ethnicity of his ethnicity or his friend's ethnicity. His family didn't go to a mosque didn't go to a mosque. His friends didn't go to church. It wasn't really until the couple of years before the war that he was really aware of which of his friends were Serbs and which were his friends were Bosniaks. And
even that happened with Jews during World War II. Once your branch is secularized, and then all of a sudden people decide religion matters. It's not like you have a say when you're like, we don't actually follow. It's like, because it has nothing to do with the actual religion and everything to do with like power.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
So the groups are. So there's this 2-year period where they're letting in peacekeepers.
Yeah,
and then
between 93 and 95, yeah.
And in 95, all hell breaks loose. So how does it go from peace and peacekeepers to tragedy?
For a combination of reasons, the Srpska army lose in late 94, early 95. The Srpska army lose the advantage they've had for most of the war. For most of the war, they've had a massive advantage in resources. They've taken over most of the weapons of the old Yugoslav army. They're being supported by Serbia. The Bosnian army is very undersupplied and unprepared. Often, they don't have uniforms and they don't have the right shoes. And then in late 94, early 95, that starts to change. Serbia, the Milosevic government, under international pressure, essentially cuts off Karadzic. They stop providing him with aid. They stop resources going over the border. And the international community starts giving a lot more help to the Bosnian army, including occasional NATO airstrikes on Srpska army positions. And Karadzic at this point decides that, okay, we're going to take control of the enclaves to try and at least have a solid block in eastern Bosnia that's connected, that will border Serbia, a solid, homogeneously Serb area. And so he orders the army to try and capture the enclaves, and in particular for Srebrenica, he issues this order known as Directive 7. He orders them to, and I'm quoting now, complete the physical separation of Srebrenica from Žepa as soon as possible, preventing even communication between individuals in the two enclaves. By planned and well thought out combat operations, create an unbearable situation of total insecurity with no hope of further survival or life for the inhabitants of Srebrenica.
And that's an official document?
Yeah.
That's...
Now, I was at a talk about this last year, actually. I don't think at this point he's thinking about a whole-scale massacre. I think he, at this point, is trying to starve them into submission, essentially, so that they will agree to surrender, give up, and he can deport them all to the main Bosnian territory. I don't think he's thinking at this point that there's going to be that he's planning on killing everyone. But at this point, the situation from March 95, the situation of the enclave starts to get more and more desperate. And in the Ratko Mladic, the Serb Nationalist Army commander, he takes prisoner several UN peacekeepers to ward off NATO airstrikes. Essentially, he takes them as hostages. And then in early July, the Srpska army begin an offensive against Srebrenica, and the local Bosniak defenders, they really don't. They're not trained soldiers. Most of them are not trained soldiers. A lot of them don't really have proper guns or ammunition. They can't really defend the town. And so what they end up doing is falling back from Srebrenica on the 11th of July to a village the village of Potocari, which is slightly north of Srebrenica, which is also where the UN peacekeepers HQ was. By this point, as maybe a lot of people know, the UN peacekeepers are a Dutch battalion. And
I actually met one of the peacekeepers when I was in Normandy. So I was in Normandy. This was actually I cried at the end of this conversation. So when I was in Normandy last year for the 73rd anniversary of D-Day, there are a lot of reenactors who reenact the Dutch Irene Brigade. And I was talking to one of them and an actual Dutch commander, and he was talking about how horrific the experience was as a peacekeeper there, witnessing, there was some Muslim boys that were massacred that they just could not save. I mean, there's a lot, but his particular experience, it's it still scars him. And so I just started, it's the anniversary of D-Day. It was a very emotional day anyway. And he's telling the story of having to watch some people be massacred in this situation, and it haunts him.
So yeah, when they fall back to Potocari, they sort of come to a decision. Most of the women and children, a few men, mostly elderly men or young teenage boys, decide to stay at the UN compound to try and pack as many people inside as possible. But ultimately, there really isn't space for it to contain more than 20,000 people. So a lot of them just stay outside and wait for Mladic and the Serb soldiers to come and hope that the UN will negotiate their safety somehow. Most of the men, including the militiamen, about 10 to 15,000 men, decide that they don't think that they're going to be safe if they stay. They think they will all be killed. And so they decide to try and make it through the forests and hills of eastern Bosnia to break out towards the city of Tuzla, which is about 60, 70 miles to the northwest. And so they set off on that night, and the Serb soldiers arrive the next day. They, after a round of atrocities against the villagers at the against the refugees at the compound, they eventually deport all of the women and children to the main Bosnian territory further west, and separate the men from the population. And over the next, over the course of the next week, mostly, they gradually ambush and capture the majority of the men in the fleeing column, about 8,000 of them, and the column was about between 10 and 15,000 originally. So more than half of them are captured, and they are taken to various detention centres, usually old schools or old farmhouses, where they're kept from anything from a few hours to a couple of days. They're then taken out, put on buses, taken to isolated areas, such as fields or forests, and taken out in groups and shot by the thousand. Sorry, I do need to take a break when talking about this sometimes.
Yeah, it's yeah. I'm trying to think. So lately, the show has covered some darker topics. Yeah. And I'm really proud whenever we put those episodes out, because I think those are important things to know. And I imagine with what your podcast covers that you deal with a lot of, it's funny though, because you love the Balkans and you love all of the former Yugoslavia, but because the history is the way that it is, you probably spend a lot of your time researching massacres. Well,
at this point, at the point I'm at in the podcast at the moment, it's a bit easier because this is still stuff that happened more than 100 years ago. It's not stuff that anyone is still alive to remember. I think when I get to World War II, that's when it's going to start getting harder, because then I have to start talking about the Ustasha and the genocide of the Serbs in World War II. But yeah, this one is quite a bit harder, just because it's just barely 20 years ago, and because I've met people who it happened to, and yeah.
I haven't met anyone that I know specifically that this happened to, other than that peacekeeper who was haunted by not being able to save people, but that's different than being in a population that is trying to be exterminated. It's adjacent pain, but it's not the same pain. But when I was in, I've talked about this on the show before, like when I was in Cambodia, every time I looked at a person who was over 40, you knew that they survived.
Yeah.
And what had they seen and what did they had to do? And that was heavy. And that is a little different than like traveling places where, or like, so like Berlin, like Berlin is different because even though like you're there and people have survived a lot, they try not to let the scars show very much, you know?
Yeah.
And it's like very on the surface when you're talking about like Chernobyl or Cambodia or the former Yugoslavia in parts, Kosovo, like, so, but it's, so there's a thing that Dan Carlin talks about on his like Mongolia series that I try to remember. It's like the people that this stuff happened to that lived 500 years ago were also people. And so,
yeah, of course.
It's like, so we should really feel this terrible all the time when talking about history. Which is just like a bit, you can't physically make yourself experience the pain of others that deeply all the time, or you just wouldn't be able to survive. Like you wouldn't be able to look at the stuff because you wouldn't survive it. Yeah, of
course.
So, okay, so what's the estimated death toll from these exterminations?
The official figure, you can give or take a few, that's given at the Memorial Centre is 8,373.
So
now, it's possible that there are a few who haven't been identified. It's not clear that they died in this particular massacre. That they might have been killed somewhere else in Bosnia or something like that. So that's not absolutely exact. It has been changed by a few numbers a couple of times, but we're talking 8,500 more or less.
That's, I mean, even just to think about what it would have been like for somebody in the opposing army who was forced to be in that army. Yeah. Because, like, you know, there are, like, to do that kind of work, like, and then just to be, like, that's just, and this happens in our lifetime. Yeah. This is history, but it's not history. Like, this happened during the Clinton administration. Like, the movie I, Tonya that just came out last year about Tonya Harding, this happened after that. It's so hard to process how close this is.
Yeah, most... one of the survivors that most of the survivors I was meeting, they're not old men. They're barely in their 40s, if that. Yeah. They have little kids, and
that's why I think it's really interesting. And we'll go back into the history in a minute, but like. Being in Bosnia, being in Serbia, whenever you met someone who was like in their 20s and they're so optimistic and you're just like, how, like, where does that come from? You know? Because I found young people in the Balkans, but especially in the former Yugoslavia, to be some of the most liberal, most passionate, like most like involved people I've ever met.
Yeah. It's very... I mean, it's very weird watching some of these survivors talk to each other. The level of they can be very upbeat people and make very even to each other, they make very morbid jokes about the 90s and what they went through. And to an extent, this is a coping mechanism. But I guess it's also, once you've survived that, what else can they do to you? Nothing. Yeah.
Yeah, and also, like, I think the former Yugoslavia has done more work on overcoming the pain than some areas of the world. Probably that has a little bit to do with white privilege, it being a European place, and so more money and time was thrown into it. But like Trevor Noah talks about, like, so I was listening to an interview with Trevor Noah where he was talking about, like, the reconciliation trials that went on in South Africa and how important they were. And like, it's like that. It's like, they didn't do that exactly, but they did more work than I think.
Yeah.
I think they've done more work than, like, America ever has with some of our issues.
Mm. The obvious comparison that a lot of people go to, obviously, is Rwanda, which obviously there was also genocide in Rwanda, a much larger genocide that happened in 1994, so more or less at the same time. And the situation in Bosnia got a lot more media attention at the time. And if you compare the tribunals, because obviously both tribunals have been set up for both, but the Yugoslavia one got quite a bit more resources from the international community.
Yeah.
And to an extent that it's almost as if people expect mass killings to be normal in Africa. In that sense, whereas people think it's strange and newsworthy that white people are killing each other.
Exactly, and you can see how, like, this was such a pre 9/11 situation that it's white Muslims, white Christians of two different major denominations, and the religion. I feel like if this had happened today, the religious aspect would be so demonized in Western culture that it might not.
Yeah. With that said, though, I should note, with regard to some of the, there were a lot of demeaning and often outright racist comments from particularly UN soldiers who were stationed in the area, but also other international other international figures. Like, for example, in there was in the UN compound in Potocari, there's still some of the graffiti that the Dutch UN soldiers scribbled on the walls that they were expecting no one to see. And one of the more infamous, I can't remember the exact wording, but it says something like, "Does she have a mustache? Does she smell like shit? She must be a Bosnian girl." Oh, God. Yeah. And obviously this was seen after the war, and but even among higher up figures, like I wrote my MA thesis on David Owen, who was involved in the mediation process of the peace process, and when he met Alija Izetbegovic, who was the president of Bosnia and was the head of the Muslim Bosniak Nationalist Party, one of the comments he made in his memoirs is Izetbegovic doesn't look like a Muslim. Oh. I think it was like, oh, he looks European. I think, well, what were you expecting him to look like?
He is a European. There are European Muslims because Turkey was a European power. People are so good. So we talked about what happened to the men. Mm-hmm. What happened to the women during this time? Because the men were separated and massacred. Yeah. What was life like for women who I'm sure were happy they weren't being massacred, but life is not good for women in war?
With regards to the women, it's particularly what happens in the couple of days after the the Serb soldiers arrive at Potocari on the 11th, and then they leave on the think the afternoon of the 12th. And over the course of that night, there are a lot of rapes. There's stories of the soldiers walking into the compound, looking for a girl, and then picking one up and raping her in front of everybody. The stories of pregnant women having to give birth, and then the babies are crying, obviously, and then the soldiers saying, "Shut him up, or I'll shut him up," and then grabbing them and killing the babies. And though the killings and atrocities there are limited both by the fact that nothing was organised in this. This is arbitrary rather than systematic, if you know what I mean.
Yeah, so they had that memo out, but then they just kind of discriminately were assaulting the women and children. This is soldiers who've been let off the leash and told they can do whatever they want. It's not a case of they've been given a particular plan. Though, particularly in 1992, there was quite a big precedent of rape being used in Bosnia as a weapon of war. There were cases in 1992 when all of the various towns in eastern Bosnia were taken over. There were a few cases where the women were rounded up and taken to concentration camps, which were essentially rape camps. So this is heavy stuff. There's a particularly infamous one in a hotel in Visegrad that today, I think it's in Visegrad anyway. That today, if you can go to that hotel, it's just a normal hotel. There's no memorial sign that anything happened there. You can just go to the hotel and pay for a room. That's where I stayed. So I stayed for 3 days in Visegrad, and I did not know that was there. And I've thought about going back a lot because it's a really beautiful town on the side of the river. And the UNESCO site that's there is this 500-year-old Ottoman bridge. And and I bought the novel, The Bridge on the Drina, which is about this place, but I haven't actually dove into it like I want to. And I'm kind of in my head, I'm like, maybe I'll go back for a few days next year and read the novel beside the river. And now I'm like, I should really go because I would like to photograph that hotel. That is crazy.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
And I'm wondering if I saw it because I stayed in an apartment. So I definitely didn't stay there. But that's the thing is like, what if you people stay there and they don't know.
Mm. I just find it strange how it's because there isn't even there's not even a plaque there apparently.
Oh wow! Well, so there's this. I did an episode about this place where a trans woman in Spain was murdered in Barcelona, and she was actually murdered in 1992. So we're talking similar time, and local activists just put up a plaque to her. And just decided there was going to be a plaque there, and then the city adopted it officially this decade. But if somebody wants there to be a plaque, you don't have to wait. And this is just good, not just for this place, but just anywhere in the world. If there's something historic and important you think happened somewhere, you can just go make one, and then normalize it yourself.
Yeah, and I was recently on a course about this kind of memory activism and people just going and setting up memory sites like for example there were in Prijedor, which is a town in northern Bosnia which as like all the others it was attacked and by Serb nationalist paramilitaries, and the Bosniak population was massacred and expelled and taken to concentration camps. But for the ones who were left behind until they were expelled too, they were made to wear like white armbands. and now there is a day every day where called White Arm Monday, where activists commemorate it. And there was a big thing in Serbia a couple of years ago where activists went and put white armbands on statues of Gavrilo Princip on that day.
Oh, okay.
Which is interesting.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I don't know if I would know if I saw that and I was walking down the street, if I would know what that was supposed to mean.
Yeah.
Like I was in Iceland, and one day they put red scarves on all the statues. But it was before smartphones had internet, so I didn't know what it meant, and I still don't know what it means.
Yeah.
But I have some weird photos of Icelandic statues with red scarves. So how does the situation resolve itself?
In Srebrenica?
Yeah. Like, how does... all right, so we have this height, like, because this massacre is kind of like this crescendo. And what happens after?
Just to finish off what happens to Srebrenica, obviously the women and children are deported to Bosnian army territory. After about a week of marching, the men, or the surviving men, do eventually break through to Tuzla, often completely, with their clothes torn, on bare, bleeding feet. A lot of them starving. Some of them have gone slightly mad due to not having enough food and drink. But so that's ultimately where the situation in Srebrenica ends. A few weeks after Srebrenica, Žepa falls too, and there is a smaller massacre there because there weren't as many people there. And Gorazda never falls. Gorazda survives the war. There's a graphic novel about this by Joe Sarcho called Safe Area Gorazda, if anyone's interested. And
we'll put a link in the show notes to that.
Yeah. And but by this point, the Srpska army is very much on the back foot. The Bosnian army and the Croatian army are pushing them back further and further. But eventually, the US come in and say, okay, that's far enough. We want a more or less 50-50 split of territory, and they come in and hammer out the Dayton peace agreement between Tudjman, the president of Croatia, Slobodan Milosevic, president of Serbia, and Izetbegovic. Crucially, that does cut out the local Bosnian Serb leaders like Karadzic, who are indicted as war criminals, and they're cut out of having anything to do with the negotiation process. But that's ultimately how the war ends in late 1995.
And then, so I think one of the legacies of this time period that has lasted is the war tribunals and the genocide trials. And I think even as recently as 2017, these are still in the news. How do those start, and what is that process like? I think there's probably the second most famous after the Nuremberg trials.
Yeah, probably. They are a bit different from the Nuremberg trials in a sense that the Nuremberg trials were very much set up with a sense of there was a sense of victor's justice to it, and that wasn't really intended as a hypocritical thing at the time. It was we're going to have trials for the defeated Nazis because the alternative is we're just going to kill them all without trial. Whereas the ICTY, the Yugoslav tribunal, was set up with a much more balanced remit, that they were going to try all sides and not pay any attention to the rights and wrongs of the war itself, just address the war crimes that were committed in it. And it was set up in 1993 by UN resolution as a bit of a sop to show they were doing something, to show that they were condemning the war crimes. They started quite small. Like one of the first trials, first indictments, was actually of a minor concentration camp guard, and in the later years of the tribunal, they never would have bothered trying him. They'd have left him to be dealt with by local courts. But they gradually built their way up to indicting higher and higher rank people, until eventually, after he was overthrown in 2000, they did indict Slobodan Milosevic and put him on trial, but he died slightly before the trial ended, and so ultimately he never got a guilty verdict. But many of the other war criminals were tried. Franjo Tudjman probably would have been tried if or would have at least been indicted if he'd lived longer. There were a lot of the Croat nationalists in Bosnia, when they were put on trial for war crimes, the verdicts very clearly linked them to him and would have required that they put him on trial as well. But he died in 1999, so they couldn't put him on trial. Obviously, Karadzic and Mladic went into hiding for a long time. And then Karadzic was found in 2008 and Mladic in 2011. And they've both had their verdicts in the past couple of years. And they were both found guilty of genocide. Karadzic, I believe, was given 40 years, he's in his 70s, so that's essentially a life sentence for him. And Mladic was given an absolute life sentence, no possibility of parole.
So a couple things. When somebody is found guilty, where is the prison that they're held in? Does the UN have a prison?
I don't know. I think it depends on a lot of things. It can be various prisons in Europe that are considered suitable for the situation. In fact, there was one of the Mladic's right-hand men, a guy called Branislav Krstic, who was actually the first person who was ever found convicted of genocide, because genocide was not a formal crime at the Nuremberg tribunals. They just had crimes against humanity. So Krstic was the first person convicted of genocide, and he was actually for a while in a prison near where I live.
Oh, really?
Yeah. So they can be. I think some of them, particularly if they're still awaiting trial, are held in prisons in the Netherlands.
That would make sense.
Yeah, but I know there have been some in prisons in Norway and various places.
You know what's one of the interesting things about this is, even as recently as, probably more recently than this, but even in 2002, Srpska was still denying that the mass graves and the massacres even existed. And that's after these trials have started.
Oh, well, there's still some who are denying it today. There's the report that officially acknowledged it. Milorad Dodik, the current president of Republika Srpska, he's actually trying to get the report annulled at the moment.
Wow.
Yeah, and to an extent, this is all politics, and everyone knows, even he knows, that the damage is done now. That cancelling the report is not going to have the same effect as if the report had never happened. And now most of the denial has shifted slightly from this never happened to okay, it happened, but it was 2,000 people, not 8,000 people, or okay, it happened, but most of them were soldiers. So the denial has taken a step back. But yes, it's still very much happening.
And they're still finding mass graves, right? There are some out there they believe exist, but they haven't uncovered them.
Yeah, well, they're not. Well, the thing about the mass graves is the people were buried in mass graves immediately after they were killed, but in the next few months, the Serb soldiers dug up and moved them to other mass graves elsewhere across eastern Bosnia in an attempt to try and throw people off the scent. And so a lot of the bodies are scattered over 2 or more mass graves. And it's taken a long time to find these. I don't think they're finding too many more graves. It's going to be a struggle to find more graves than they found. There are still some out there, but I think it's going to be very hard for them to find unless someone comes forward with testimony of where it is.
So one thing to know that I think is interesting, because when I mentioned earlier that Russia is a Serbian ally, and in Srpska, Russia is beloved, and you find pictures of Putin randomly. In 2015, Russia actually vetoed a UN resolution that was going to officially claim that this was a genocide as a favor to Serbia. Yeah. So even though this is history, it's not that much history, and it is still affecting current international politics.
Yeah. In Serbia itself, as opposed to Republika Srpska, there's more acceptance that this happened. The actual facts. While there are still a few far right figures who deny the genocide, in Serbia the attitude is more to accept the facts of what happened, but either still say, okay, the massacre happened, but it's not genocide, or to say, yeah, but similar things happened to Serbs as well, or something like that. Yeah, the denial, or at least playing down of it, is not as strong in Serbia as it is in Srpska.
So let's talk a little bit about your trip, because part of why we wanted specifically to circle back and talk about this incident was that you were recently there. And so why were you there? And tell us a little bit about the event that you got to go to.
Well, I was doing the Peace March, or Marsh Mira, as it is in Bosnian, which is what they do is every year in the 3 days before the anniversary of the massacre, a load of people march from Nezuk, which is the village near Tuzla, where the survivors eventually made it to safety, and walk down to Potocari. So essentially doing a reverse march of the original death march. And on the morning of the 11th, you go to the anniversary commemorations of the massacre. So I did that. So I was marching for 3 days, about 60 miles, 90 kilometers in total.
In the height of Balkan summer.
Yeah. Well, actually, that wasn't as bad as you think. I was warned to expect quite bad sun and to be worried about sunburn, and that was the situation on the first day. I got quite bad sunburn on the second day. So the second day, I was more prepared, completely sun creamed up, and it absolutely the rain absolutely chucked it down all day. And they said they never expected this. The weather's not normally like this in eastern Bosnia in the summer, but when you have 6,000 people walking on muddy forest paths in the pouring rain, the terrain gets chewed up quite badly. It was very difficult to make it through. There was a lot of very slippy mud. I had to be helped along quite a bit of the way by local helpers. Yeah.
So what made you decide to attend the march?
Well, I was going to be in the region anyway, because I was going to a course in Belgrade a couple of weeks before. So I thought, and I saw this. I found the site that was running a program to take international attendees to this thing as part of another course, and I thought I should go along, because obviously I'm going to be doing my PhD on Bosnia, and I thought it would be good to go and see some of the places that I'd talked about and that I work on. It was a very both physically exhausting and quite emotionally exhausting experience.
I think that's awesome, though. That's exactly why I do this show. Because I think, one, not everyone can go to these places, but if you can go and you can go to maybe the one or two or three that are the most powerful to you, it will totally change your perspective of what happened. And then that will help you understand that you don't understand anything about human history. So it really just makes you feel dumb, but in the best way possible.
Mm-hmm.
But then also like these places deserve to be seen and talked about. And so for me personally, whenever I go somewhere that I've like only read about, it changes my perspective. Then I can come back and talk about it in a way that maybe is different than I would have before. And then it makes me want to go somewhere else because I know that I don't know really jack about that place either.
Yeah.
So what was it like being there, like emotionally?
Well, on the march itself, one of the things I'd like to mention is you pass through a lot of returnee villages. And these are like small communities because obviously, like I say, there was killing and expulsions in all of these places across eastern Bosnia in the summer of 1992. But since 1995, there's been quite a few. It's hard to guess exactly how many because not everyone is there all the time. People who've moved back to their old towns and villages and tried to reconstruct their old communities. And as the march, this is a big. And when the march goes through the region, it tries to go through as many of these returnee Bosniak villages as possible. And you can tell when you're walking through that this is quite a big day for them. They've all gone to the shops or grown something like a load of fruit and coffee specifically so that they can give it to the marchers. And they all come out and line the roads and cheer everyone on, which is quite nice. That's quite uplifting, and they're all very happy to see you there. But that experience is quite different to when you turn the final corner and you turn into Potocari. And then you're walking down the road. When you've got on the right side of the road, you've got the cemetery, the memorial, and on the left side of the road, you've got the old UN HQ, which is now mostly a museum. And when we turned onto that road, that was lined by people who'd come out to see the marches as well. But that was almost completely silent. It just suddenly went quiet, completely silent. No one was saying anything. And unlike the earlier returnee villages, the people at the side of the road were not happy, smiling and cheering. They were very solemn. No one was smiling. Some people were recording with their phones, but yeah, it was a much more solemn atmosphere, and that was quite hard hitting. So yeah, I don't know what else I can say at the march. It's quite tiring. You do see signs commemorating massacres and mass graves along the way, but it's not until you get to Potocari that it really starts to hit you, I don't think.
So if somebody wanted to participate in this march, is this something that someone without your background could do?
There is a program that I applied for. It's not a big program, and I don't want to just hand out the details because I don't want them to be deluged with requests.
Well, don't worry, I don't think on my show we're going to be deluged with requests. But
okay.
If somebody was interested in going to the march, they could Google the march, a Bosnian Peace March, and
the site's set up for this kind of thing.
Yeah,
I have my doubts that they'll have set up sites for next year yet, but if people start looking in the new year, assuming everything's still all right in Bosnia, then you'll start to see sites, both official sites and people running programs for it that you can apply to. Yeah.
So what's next for you in terms of this kind of research? Or is there another place that you now feel like you need to go maybe next summer?
Well, I want to go back to Sarajevo. I had a few days in Sarajevo, but only really one properly free day. The rest of the days I was at lectures and stuff. So I do feel there's more for me to see in Sarajevo that I didn't really get to see. For example, there's a museum of what they call war childhood experiences. That's mostly about children in Sarajevo during the siege. And I'd quite like to go and see that. And there's a few other memorials in the city that I'd like to go and see. Other than that, I was also I was in Mostar and Dubrovnik while I was travelling around. I think I've seen most of what there is to see there, to be honest. Yeah.
I love Mostar. I think Mostar is one of the most beautiful cities I've been in. It's fantastic, but yeah, it's very small.
Yeah, it's beautiful. I'd highly recommend going back, but you don't need more than 2 or 3 days there to see everything.
Yeah, I was there for a week and I definitely saw every single thing.
Yeah.
But if you want that, actually, Mostar is on the main image on my site, and in my profile pic on all my media accounts, it's me in front of that bridge because it's such an iconic historic spot. But I also like it because the story of that bridge is so much more than, it's not just an old bridge, it's also got modern history because it was part of the war and it was
rebuilt. I think it was only finished rebuilt in 2004, I think.
So there's so many layers of the history there, so even though I don't think people, when they see that picture, think that, but for me, I personally like that, and also I look good in that picture. So, so I highly recommend people go to Mostar. And then, so if this story has piqued your interest to learn about Yugoslavia, you should definitely check out Alex's last episode when he came on to talk about Belgrade. And then, Alex, where can they tell us a little bit about your podcast?
It's called The History of Yugoslavia. If you search really any podcast app, you should be able to find it. If you just search The History of Yugoslavia. It has a website. It's called ethnopolis.co.uk is where it lives. I usually post about it on Twitter. I'm just there at Alex Crook. Currently about to start, in fact, the first one will probably have come out by the time you're hearing this, on the First World War. That's how far we've got up to at the moment. So what happened, everyone knows about Franz Ferdinand and the assassination. Not that many people know about what happened in the Balkans after that.
Yeah.
So we're now doing that story.
That's amazing. So yeah, moving to the Balkans made me realize, holy shit, I don't really know that much about. There's such important high chapters, right? So you've got the fall of the Byzantine Empire. You've got a little bit about what it was like when it was part of Turkey, World War I, World War II, the 90s. It's really crazy how little I knew in between any of those. So, Alex, thank you so much for coming back.
No worries. Thanks for having me again.